March 3, 1943, Bismarck Sea off New Guinea. Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura commanding Destroyer Squadron 3 with 8 destroyers escorting 8 transports packed with 6,900 troops of the Imperial Japanese Army 51st Division. Lieutenant General George Kenney's U.S. 5th Air Force B-25 Mitchell medium bombers, each modified with 8 forward-firing 50-caliber Browning machine guns by Major Paul Gunn. The mission: prevent Japanese reinforcement of La at any cost, using whatever means necessary. The morning sun climbed higher over the Bismarck Sea as Admiral Kimura stood on the bridge of his flagship, the destroyer Shirayuki. Behind him stretched a formation that represented Japan's last desperate attempt to reinforce New Guinea by sea. 8 transport ships wallowed through the swells, their holds crammed with soldiers, ammunition, fuel, and the future of Japanese operations in the Southwest Pacific. Around them, 8 destroyers maintained a protective screen, their anti-aircraft guns trained skyward, crews scanning the horizon for the American bombers they knew would come. Kimura had graduated 107th out of 118 cadets from the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy. Hardly an outstanding record, but war had taught him lessons no classroom could provide. He had assisted in rescuing survivors from the heavy cruiser Mikuma after American bombers devastated the ship during the Battle of Midway. He understood what American air power could do to Japanese ships caught in daylight without adequate fighter cover. Yet Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo had given him no choice. The troops in these transports were desperately needed at La, and every alternative route meant a march of over 140 miles through disease-ridden jungle without roads. The convoy had departed Simpson Harbor at Rabaul just after midnight on March 1st, taking advantage of storm fronts that would provide natural concealment. Kimura's destroyers included some of the most battle-hardened vessels in the Imperial Navy: Shirayuki, Shikanami, Uranami, Tokitsuke's, Yukike's, Asashio, Arashio, and Asagumo. Each had survived the brutal fighting around Guadalcanal, their crews veterans of night battles where Japanese destroyer tactics had proven superior to American forces. But this was different. This was daylight in waters where American land-based aircraft ruled supreme. Lieutenant General Hatazo Adachi, commander of the Japanese 18th Army, traveled aboard the destroyer Tokitsuke's, while Lieutenant General Hidemitsu Nakano of the 51st Division had taken passage on Yukike's. The presence of such high-ranking officers underscored the convoy's critical importance. These were not expendable troops but elite formations whose arrival at La could determine whether Japan maintained its foothold in New Guinea or watched the entire campaign collapse. At his headquarters at Port Moresby, Lieutenant General George Churchill Kenney studied reconnaissance photographs of the Japanese convoy with the intensity of a hunter examining tracks. Kenney had arrived in the Southwest Pacific in July 1942 to find General Douglas MacArthur's air forces demoralized and ineffective. Traditional bombing tactics had proven useless against moving ships, with medium-altitude attacks achieving less than 1% hit rates. But Kenney possessed something his predecessors lacked: an innovative mind willing to challenge doctrine and the engineering expertise to make radical modifications work. The key figure in Kenney's transformation of Pacific air warfare stood beside him examining the same photographs. Major Paul "Pappy" Gunn, a former enlisted Navy aviator whose wife and children remained trapped in the Philippines, had channeled his personal fury into revolutionary aircraft modifications. Gunn understood that attacking ships required getting close, very close, and that meant suppressing anti-aircraft fire before delivering bombs. His solution was elegantly simple: remove the bombardier position from B-25 Mitchell medium bombers and install 8 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns in the nose and side pods. These modified B-25C-1 aircraft had proven devastatingly effective in earlier tests. Each machine gun fired 850 rounds per minute, sending armor-piercing, incendiary, and tracer rounds at 2,910 feet per second. 8 guns firing simultaneously could put 6,800 rounds per minute into a target, enough firepower to shred any ship's superstructure and slaughter its anti-aircraft crews. The pilots called it skip bombing, approaching at wave-top height and releasing bombs 500 yards from the target. The bombs would skip across the water like thrown stones, detonating against the ship's hull below the waterline where armor was thinnest. As Kenney and Gunn planned their attack, they understood the implications extended far beyond sinking Japanese ships. This convoy represented Japan's last realistic chance to reinforce WWII. If it succeeded, Japanese forces might stabilize their position in New Guinea and potentially threaten Australia itself. If it failed, Japan would be forced to rely on submarines and small coastal barges, effectively conceding control of New Guinea's waters to Allied forces. The modified B-25s that would spearhead Kenny's attack represented a radical departure from pre-war bombing doctrine. Traditional thinking emphasized precision bombing from medium altitude using the Norden bombsight, a complex mechanical computer that promised pinpoint accuracy. But moving ships posed problems the Norden's designers had never anticipated. By the time bombs fell from 10,000 feet, ships could alter course and escape the blast radius. Skip bombing eliminated this problem by reducing release altitude to under 250 feet and time of flight to seconds rather than minutes. Major Ed Larner commanded the 90th Bombardment Squadron's B-25s that would lead the skip bombing attack. Larner had trained his crews relentlessly, using a half-submerged wreck in Port Moresby Harbor as target practice. Each pilot learned to use reference points on their aircraft's nose instead of the traditional bombsight, releasing bombs at precisely the right moment to achieve the flat trajectory skip bombing required. One crew had been killed when their B-25 struck the target wreck's mast, but Larner's remaining pilots had developed an almost supernatural accuracy with their unconventional technique. The aircraft that would execute Kenny's plan represented the cutting edge of 1943 aviation technology adapted for a mission their designers had never envisioned. The B-25C-1 Mitchell weighed 21,100 pounds empty and could carry 3,200 pounds of bombs at a maximum speed of 275 miles per hour. But guns modifications had transformed these medium bombers into something unprecedented. Aircraft that could both strafe and bomb with devastating effectiveness. The forward-firing armament alone weighed over 1,200 pounds, including guns, ammunition, and reinforced mounting structures designed to absorb the tremendous recoil forces generated by 8 machine guns firing simultaneously. Royal Australian Air Force units would provide crucial support for Kenny's attack. 13 Bristol Beaufighter twin-engine fighters from No. 30 Squadron carried 4 20mm cannons and 6 machine guns, perfect for suppressing anti-aircraft fire. Unlike the American B-25s, these aircraft had been designed from the beginning as fighters, with armor protection for pilots and self-sealing fuel tanks to survive battle damage. Their role would be to sweep the convoy's decks clear of gunners just before the skip bombers arrived, maximizing the Americans' chances of survival during their low-altitude bombing runs. As dawn broke on March 2nd, the Japanese convoy was approximately 200 miles from La, maintaining course and speed despite growing awareness that Allied reconnaissance aircraft had spotted them. Kimura's radio operators intercepted increasing American radio traffic, clear indication that attack preparations were underway. The admiral faced an agonizing choice: maintain speed toward La and accept the certainty of air attack, or disperse his convoy and likely lose most of the transports to submarine attacks in the narrow waters approaching New Guinea. The first American attack came at 10 a.m. on March 2nd when 8 B-17 Flying Fortress heavy bombers approached the convoy from 7,000 feet. These 4-engine aircraft represented America's pre-war bombing philosophy, designed to destroy industrial targets through precision high-altitude attacks. Against ships, however, their effectiveness remained questionable. The B-17s dropped 1,000-pound general-purpose bombs that created spectacular waterspouts but achieved only one direct hit, sinking the transport Kyakusei Maru. More importantly, the attack scattered the convoy's tight formation, making the ships vulnerable to the low-level attack that Kenny was preparing. Watching from Shirayuki's bridge, Admiral Kimura assessed the damage with growing concern. One transport lost, others scattered across several miles of ocean, and this was merely the preliminary attack. Intelligence reports indicated that American air strength in New Guinea had increased dramatically over recent months, with new aircraft types and tactics that Japanese forces had not previously encountered. The admiral's greatest fear was not the bombs themselves, but the possibility that his ships would be caught scattered and unable to provide mutual anti-aircraft support when the main attack arrived. Throughout the night of March 2nd-3rd, Royal Australian Air Force consolidated PBY Catalina flying boats shadowed the convoy, transmitting position reports that allowed Kenny's forces to plan their attack with precision. These twin-engine seaplanes could remain airborne for over 20 hours, making them ideal for long-range reconnaissance missions. Their crews understood that maintaining contact with the convoy was crucial for the success of the following day's attack. Even though they're slow, lumbering aircraft were extremely vulnerable to Japanese fighters. As March 3rd dawned clear and calm, Kimura found himself commanding a convoy that had already lost 1/8 of its transport capacity while still 60 miles from Leh. His destroyers had rescued 950 survivors from Kyakusei Maru, but the overcrowded warships now carried hundreds of soldiers in addition to their normal crews. Worse, the scattered formation meant that when the next attack came, his ships would face it individually rather than concentrating their anti-aircraft fire. At 7:30 a.m., reconnaissance aircraft reported that Allied bombers were taking off from airfields around Port Moresby. Kimura ordered his ships to close formation and prepare for coordinated evasive action, but he understood the fundamental disadvantage facing his convoy. Japanese air cover consisted of approximately 100 Zero fighters based at Leh, but these aircraft lacked the range to provide continuous protection over the convoy's route. American forces, by contrast, could attack from multiple airfields with different aircraft types arriving in carefully coordinated waves. The attack that would become known as the Battle of the Bismarck Sea began at 10 a.m. on March 3rd when the first wave of Allied aircraft appeared on the horizon. Kimura immediately ordered all ships to increase speed and begin evasive maneuvers, but the convoy's tight formation limited his options. The transports, loaded with troops and supplies, could not match the destroyer's speed or maneuverability. This meant the faster warships had to choose between abandoning their charges or accepting the limitations imposed by escorting slow-moving targets. 13 Royal Australian Air Force Beaufighters approached the convoy at wave-top height, their twin engines creating a distinctive sound that Japanese lookouts had learned to fear. These aircraft had originally been designed as night fighters, equipped with early airborne radar sets, but they had proven equally effective in daylight strafing attacks. Each Beaufighter carried 4 20mm Hispano cannons in its nose, weapons capable of penetrating light armor and destroying exposed equipment with explosive shells rather than simple machine gun bullets. The Beaufighter's attack followed Kenny's tactical plan perfectly. Instead of approaching from different directions, all 13 aircraft came in from the starboard side of the convoy, forcing Japanese anti-aircraft gunners to concentrate their fire in one sector. This left other areas of the ship's defenses temporarily unmanned, creating the opening that guns modified B-25s needed to begin their skip bombing runs. The timing had been rehearsed repeatedly, with each pilot understanding that success depended on split-second coordination between different aircraft types with vastly different capabilities. Major Larner led 12 B-25C-1 strafers in their approach just moments after the Beaufighters completed their strafing runs. Flying at 30 feet above the waves at 230 miles per hour, the American bombers presented targets that Japanese gunners found almost impossible to track. Traditional anti-aircraft doctrine assumed attackers would approach from medium altitude, giving defenders time to calculate range and deflection. Skip bombers eliminated this advantage by compressing the entire attack into seconds rather than minutes. The sound of Larner's B-25s was unlike anything Japanese sailors had experienced. 850 caliber machine guns firing simultaneously created a noise described by one survivor as like a giant canvas being torn apart by invisible hands. Each aircraft carried 3,840 rounds of mixed ammunition, armor-piercing rounds to penetrate steel, incendiary rounds to start fires, and tracer rounds to help pilots aim. At 200 yards range, these weapons could penetrate the hull plating of any destroyer and slaughter exposed personnel with devastating effectiveness. Shirayuki took the first concentrated burst from Larner's lead aircraft just as the admiral was ordering emergency turns to avoid the incoming bombers. 50 caliber bullets swept across the destroyer's bridge, killing or wounding most of the officers and men stationed there. Admiral Kimura himself took machine gun bullets in the shoulder and stomach, wounds that would have been fatal without immediate medical attention. The same burst that wounded the admiral also destroyed the ship's primary fire control equipment, leaving her anti-aircraft guns without centralized direction. The skip bombing technique that Gunn and Larner had perfected proved devastatingly effective against ships that had been designed to resist conventional high-altitude bombing. Traditional naval armor concentrated protection around vital areas like magazines and engine rooms, with the assumption that bombs would fall from above. Skip bombs approached from the side, striking areas where hull plating was thinnest and least protected. A 500-pound bomb detonating against a destroyer's side could tear open compartments below the waterline, causing flooding that would sink the ship within minutes. Transport ships proved even more vulnerable to skip bombing attacks than the destroyers that escorted them. These vessels had been designed for cargo capacity rather than combat survivability, with minimal armor and inadequate subdivision to contain flooding. When B-25s attacked the transport Tio Maru, their combined machine gun fire killed dozens of soldiers packed into the ship's holds, while their bombs opened massive holes in her hull. The vessel began sinking immediately, forcing hundreds of troops to jump overboard into seas that would soon be filled with debris, fuel oil, and blood. The systematic destruction of Kimura's convoy unfolded with mechanical precision, as each wave of Allied aircraft found its targets scattered and unable to provide mutual support. B-17 flying fortresses attacked from medium altitude, while B-25 strafers came in at wave-top height, forcing Japanese gunners to divide their attention between threats approaching from completely different directions. Douglas A-20 Havoc light bombers added to the confusion by attacking from yet another angle, their crews using the same low-level tactics that had proven so effective for the modified B-25s. As ships began sinking throughout the convoy, thousands of Japanese soldiers and sailors found themselves in the water with only life preservers, debris, or their swimming ability to keep them alive. The transport ships carried Type A and Type B landing craft that could theoretically evacuate troops, but most of these had been destroyed by strafing before they could be launched. Those landing craft that did make it into the water carried 30 to 90 men each, depending on their size, but they represented only a tiny fraction of the convoy's total personnel. Admiral Kimura, bleeding heavily from his wounds, was transferred from the sinking Shirayuki to the destroyer Shikanami as American aircraft continued their attacks. From his new flagship, he could see the extent of the disaster unfolding around him. All 8 transports were either sinking or burning, while 3 of his 8 destroyers had been sunk or fatally damaged. The carefully planned reinforcement of La had become a massacre, with thousands of elite Japanese troops dying before they could fire a shot in defense of New Guinea. The 4 surviving destroyers Shikanami, Yukikase, Uranami, and Asagumo began rescue operations immediately, pulling survivors from the oil-covered water as quickly as their crews could manage. These ships had been designed to carry approximately 240 officers and men each, but they now took aboard hundreds of additional survivors from the sunken vessels. Overcrowding became so severe that some destroyers had survivors lashed to their decks, exposed to subsequent air attacks but alive when they might otherwise have drowned. Lieutenant General George Kenny watched the initial reports of his attack's success with satisfaction, but he understood that the battle was far from over. Intelligence estimates suggested that over 6,000 Japanese troops had been aboard the convoy's transports, and many of these men were still alive in the water or in the lifeboats and landing craft that had survived the initial attacks. If these survivors reached shore, they could still reinforce La's garrison and potentially stabilize Japanese positions in New Guinea. The decision that would make the Battle of the Bismarck Sea one of the most controversial episodes of the Pacific War came during Kenny's staff conference on the afternoon of March 3. Major General Ennis Whitehead, Kenny's deputy commander, pointed out that hundreds of Japanese were still alive in lifeboats, rafts, and landing craft scattered across the battle area. Many of these craft had small engines and could potentially reach the New Guinea coast within days. Even those without power might drift ashore or be rescued by Japanese submarines. Kenny's response would be remembered decades later by the aircrew who received his orders. "I want every goddamn Japanese in the water killed. I don't want any of them reaching shore to fight us again." The general's language reflected both the intensity of Pacific War combat and a calculation that eliminating these survivors was a military necessity. These were not merchant sailors or civilian passengers but elite combat troops whose survival could directly impact future battles. The orders that went out to Allied squadrons on the afternoon of March 3 were euphemistically described as mopping up operations, but their intent was unmistakable. Aircraft were to seek out and attack any lifeboats, rafts, or other vessels containing Japanese survivors. The justification provided to aircrew emphasized that these men were soldiers who would rejoin the fighting if rescued, not helpless shipwreck victims entitled to mercy. Some pilots accepted this reasoning without question, while others struggled with orders that seemed to violate traditional concepts of military honor. Royal Australian Air Force Squadron 30 received the first specific orders to strafe Japanese survivors on the afternoon of March 3. 10 Bristol Beaufighters took off from Milne Bay with instructions to locate and destroy any barges, lifeboats, or rafts still afloat in the battle area. The pilots found their targets scattered across nearly 20 square miles of ocean. Type A and Type B landing craft loaded with 30 to 90 survivors each, standard ship's lifeboats carrying 6 to 12 men, and improvised rafts constructed from debris. Flight Lieutenant Ronald Uren led the first systematic strafing attack on Japanese survivors, his Beaufighters' 4 20mm cannons tearing apart a Type A landing craft loaded with approximately 60 soldiers. The explosive shells designed to destroy aircraft proved devastatingly effective against unarmored boats, turning wood and metal into deadly splinters that killed or wounded everyone aboard. Uren's wingmen attacked a second landing craft with similar results, leaving only debris and bodies floating in water that quickly turned red with blood. The psychological impact on Allied aircrew varied dramatically depending on individual temperament and previous combat experience. Some pilots, particularly those who had witnessed Japanese atrocities against prisoners or civilians, approached the strafing missions with enthusiasm. Others found the attacks deeply disturbing, later describing feelings of nausea and shame that persisted long after the war ended. Squadron commanders generally supported the missions as military necessities while acknowledging the moral ambiguity involved. American B-25 crews received similar orders on March 4, with specific instructions to seek out and destroy any remaining Japanese survivors or rescue vessels. Captain Charles Howe of the 90th Bombardment Squadron reported attacking a cluster of lifeboats and rafts approximately 40 miles southeast of Finschhafen, expending 2,500 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition during 3 strafing passes. His after-action report noted that personnel in the water had been definitely put out of action, military euphemism for mass killing that avoided explicit acknowledgement of what had occurred. The systematic hunting of Japanese survivors continued for 3 days after the main battle, with Allied aircraft ranging across hundreds of square miles of ocean to ensure that no one escaped. PT boats from the U.S. Navy's Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron also participated, using their machine guns to attack survivors at point-blank range during night operations. Lieutenant Commander Barry Atkins led 8 PT boats in these attacks, later reporting the destruction of numerous lifeboats and the killing of hundreds of Japanese soldiers and sailors. Japanese submarines I-17 and I-26 attempted rescue operations during the nights of March 4 and 5, managing to recover 275 survivors before Allied air patrols forced them to submerge. These submarines represented Japan's most advanced underwater technology, but they could accommodate only a fraction of the men still alive in the water. The submarine commanders faced agonizing decisions about whom to rescue, often forced to leave wounded men behind while taking aboard those with the best chances of survival. The moral complexity of the strafing operations became apparent in the widely varying reactions of Allied aircrew. Co-pilot First Lieutenant John Donegan of the 405th Bombardment Squadron wrote in his diary, "Our destruction was not for mercy. It was simply that to us all Japanese soldiers had become things to be annihilated, not necessarily cruelly, but always thoroughly. This dehumanization of the enemy reflected months of brutal combat in which quarter was rarely given by either side." Other aircrew struggled with orders that seemed to violate fundamental concepts of military honor. Several Australian pilots reported feeling distasteful about attacking defenseless survivors, while some American crews questioned whether the strafing missions were consistent with international law. Squadron commanders generally dealt with these concerns by emphasizing the military necessity of preventing enemy reinforcement and reminding crews of Japanese atrocities committed against Allied prisoners and civilians. The strategic impact of the Battle of the Bismarck Sea extended far beyond the immediate destruction of Kimura's convoy. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Japanese Combined Fleet, described the defeat as unbelievable and a crushing blow that fundamentally altered Japan's ability to operate in the Southwest Pacific. The loss of 8 transports and 4 destroyers represented a significant portion of Japan's remaining merchant shipping, vessels that could not be replaced given American submarine warfare's impact on Japanese shipbuilding materials. More importantly, the battle demonstrated that Japan could no longer move large convoys through waters controlled by Allied land-based aircraft. Future reinforcement efforts would have to rely on submarines, small coastal vessels, and the hazardous overland routes that Japanese planners had hoped to avoid. This logistical strangulation would prove decisive in the New Guinea campaign, forcing Japanese forces to fight with inadequate supplies and reinforcements while Allied strength continued to grow. The international legal implications of the survivor strafing would not become clear until after the war ended. The 1949 Geneva Convention specifically prohibited attacks on shipwrecked military personnel, a provision that many historians believe was directly influenced by incidents like the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. During World War II, however, no clear international law protected military survivors of sunken warships, leaving commanders to make decisions based on military necessity and personal morality. German submarine warfare provided a parallel case that highlighted the moral ambiguity surrounding attacks on survivors. The Laconia incident of September 1942 had seen German U-boat U-156 attempting to rescue survivors from a torpedoed British transport, only to be attacked by Allied aircraft while displaying Red Cross flags. This incident led to the Laconia Order, which prohibited German submarines from attempting rescue operations, effectively condemning thousands of Allied merchant sailors to death in subsequent attacks. The similarities between the Laconia incident and the Bismarck Sea strafing reflected the total war mentality that characterized World War II combat. Both German and Allied commanders faced situations where traditional concepts of military honor conflicted with what they perceived as military necessity. The resulting decisions often involved accepting moral compromises that would have been unthinkable in earlier conflicts but seemed justified by the stakes involved in global warfare. Post-war analysis of the Battle of the Bismarck Sea revealed the extent to which revolutionary tactics had transformed naval warfare. Skip bombing, the brainchild of Paul Gunn and Ed Larner, had proven more effective against ships than traditional high-altitude precision bombing. The concentration of firepower achieved by Gunn's modified B-25s exceeded that of many contemporary fighters while retaining the bomb-carrying capacity of medium bombers. These innovations would influence aircraft design and tactics for decades after the war ended. The human cost of the battle reflected the broader brutality of Pacific War combat. Japanese casualties totaled approximately 3,000 killed and missing, including many of the elite 51st Division troops who had been designated to defend Lae. Allied losses numbered only 13 aircrew and 4 aircraft, a ratio that demonstrated the overwhelming advantage achieved through technological innovation and tactical surprise. For the families of Japanese soldiers and sailors lost in the battle, however, statistics provided little comfort. Admiral Masatomi Kimura survived his wounds and was evacuated to Japan for medical treatment, but his career effectively ended with the Bismarck Sea defeat. Post-war interviews revealed his continuing bitterness about the inadequate air cover provided for his convoy and the unrealistic expectations placed on naval forces operating within range of enemy land-based aircraft. Like many Japanese officers, Kimura struggled to understand how his country's initial advantages in naval aviation had been so completely reversed by American industrial production and tactical innovation. The aircrew who participated in the survivor strafing carried their experiences in different ways throughout the remainder of their lives. Some, like Captain Charles Howe, continued to defend the missions as military necessities that shortened the war and saved Allied lives. Others, particularly those who witnessed the destruction of lifeboats filled with wounded men, struggled with memories that no amount of military justification could fully resolve. The psychological impact of these missions contributed to what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder among World War II veterans. Major Paul Gunn continued refining his aircraft modifications throughout the war, eventually developing B-25 variants that carried as many as 18 forward-firing machine guns. His innovations influenced the design of specialized attack aircraft like the Douglas A-26 Invader, which incorporated many of the lessons learned from the modified B-25s. Gunn's personal motivation never wavered. Every Japanese soldier or sailor killed was one less enemy who might threaten his family still trapped in the Philippines. General Douglas MacArthur described the Battle of the Bismarck Sea as one of the most complete and annihilating combats of all time, rhetoric that reflected both the magnitude of the victory and the propaganda value of demonstrating Allied air superiority. The battle's strategic significance became apparent over subsequent months as Japanese forces in New Guinea found themselves increasingly isolated and unable to receive adequate reinforcements or supplies. La fell to Allied forces in September 1943, followed by other Japanese strongholds as the campaign progressed. The technological legacy of the battle extended beyond aviation into broader questions of military innovation and adaptation. The success of skip bombing demonstrated the value of challenging established doctrine when circumstances demanded new approaches. Traditional medium-altitude bombing had proven ineffective against ships, but creative modification of existing aircraft and tactics had achieved devastating results. This pattern of innovation under pressure would characterize much of America's World War II technological development. The moral questions raised by the survivor strafing remain subjects of historical debate 8 decades after the battle occurred. Military historians generally acknowledge the missions as violations of traditional military honor, while noting the absence of clear international law governing such situations during World War II. The development of specific protections for shipwrecked military personnel in the 1949 Geneva Conventions represented explicit recognition that such incidents should not be repeated in future conflicts. Contemporary understanding of the battle must consider the context of Pacific War brutality that influenced all participants' behavior. Japanese forces had established patterns of treating prisoners with extreme cruelty, while Allied forces had witnessed atrocities that created desires for revenge. The mutual dehumanization that resulted from this cycle of violence made decisions like the survivor strafing more likely, even as individual participants understood the moral complexity involved. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea ultimately demonstrated both the devastating effectiveness of innovative military tactics and the moral compromises that total war imposed on all participants. Admiral Kimura's convoy had represented Japan's last realistic hope of reinforcing New Guinea by sea, while General Kenny's response had ensured that such attempts would not be repeated. The price of this strategic victory included not only the 3,000 Japanese military personnel who died in the battle and its aftermath, but also the moral burden carried by Allied aircrew who participated in the survivor strafing. The technological innovations pioneered during the battle would influence military aviation for decades, while the moral questions raised by the survivor strafing would contribute to the development of international humanitarian law. Both legacies reflect the complex nature of military innovation during wartime, where tactical necessity and moral consideration often conflict in ways that seem irreconcilable. The men who fought and died in the Bismarck Sea deserve to be remembered not only for their courage and sacrifice but also for the difficult moral choices their circumstances imposed. As the sun set on March 5, 1943, the waters of the Bismarck Sea contained only debris and bodies to mark the location where Japan's last attempt to reinforce New Guinea by sea had ended in catastrophic failure. The strategic implications would shape the remainder of the Pacific War, while the moral questions raised by the survivor strafing would influence international law and military ethics for generations to come. In the end, the battle represented both the devastating effectiveness of American industrial innovation and the moral complexity that characterized World War II's total war environment.